Hi, I'm Cathy, and I'm here to tell my story, and this is my dad.
Hi, I'm Pat. Cathy, you may not remember, but when you were younger, very young, we always thought you had somewhat of a compromised immune system. You frequently had strep throat, maybe once every 2 months. And at some point, maybe around when you were 8 years of age, the doctors recommended that you have your tonsils removed, which we did, and you were slightly better, but you always seemed to be somewhat compromised.
And around the age of 10, I remember being out and around in the yard, playing, having fun, going inside one night, and there was a tick somewhere.
Oh, the tick was over your left ear. It had bitten you. It was engorged. I removed it. We took you the next day to the pediatrician to ask him to do a Lyme test, which he refused to do. We came home and we waited for several weeks to see if you would develop a rash, because he wanted to see if there was any outward signs like a bullseye rash. You never really developed the rash, but within several months, you did have some neurological symptoms, which were floaters. You became sensitive to loud sounds and bright lights. As a matter of fact, a 60-watt bulb over the kitchen table was actually too bright for you. It had to be turned off when you sat there for dinner, and you had some headaches. So we took you to a local children's hospital to see a child neurologist. Do you remember any?
I briefly remember seeing the child neurologist. I remember being very uncomfortable due to all my symptoms. And when I was in his office, I remember thinking that I couldn't sit still, I couldn't function the way I once was able to. And I remember him saying that we should wait and see over the summer if things improved.
So we waited over the summer. Things were slightly better because Cathy wasn't reading and she wasn't going to school over the summer, of course. So there was less activity and less ability to see neurologically what was happening. During the following year, when Cathy returned to school, we noticed that she was much more sensitive to light and sound. She was having difficulty walking down the hallways at school. She was going from side to side. She was also having difficulty with her sense of space when she walked into a large open room, to the extent that she actually needed help. And she was receiving physical therapy from the school physical therapist, who told us that if she hadn't known Cathy since she was 4 years old, would have thought that Cathy had suffered a traumatic brain injury.
I remember doing physical therapy with the physical therapist, and she was always very confused. She couldn't believe that I was in the position that I was. She gave me exercises, which I tried to do. I went to the physical therapy room twice a day when I was with her, and we would perform different exercises, but honestly, nothing really seemed to be improving much.
So we were, my wife and I were very concerned about Cathy's progress. So there were several things that we were pursuing. One was we knew that Cathy had balance issues, so we went to a vestibular clinic for testing on the recommendation of an ear, nose, and throat doctor. Cathy went through the vestibular test for about 20 minutes and then was pretty much marched out of the test room, and we were told that while Cathy may have a balance issue, it was not vestibular.
I remember them, they kept saying, try your best, keep trying, is this really your best? And I was getting very frustrated because it was my best, I couldn't do anything more, and they just kept pushing me, and eventually they got kind of frustrated and brought me back to my parents.
So after the testing, the neurologist who ran the vestibular clinic came in to speak with us, and in Cathy's presence, he asked us if Cathy was faking it. Where at that point I asked him to take Cathy outside and to do some testing of his own, just asking her to do some simple mechanical movements, walking down the hallway in a straight line, hop. And he came back in and said, no, she's definitely has some difficulties. We need to test for any organic reason why she may be having these neurological symptoms. Thankfully, the testing that was done was for the organic problems were negative, and at that point we left the clinic. We also were seeing a doctor for vision therapy, as Cathy's was having trouble focusing and tracking for reading. At the suggestion of one of our friends, we went down to New Haven to a doctor who treated Lyme disease, and we saw him for 2 years. Cathy was diagnosed with Lyme, babesiosis, and Bartonella. She was treated with antibiotics, and while she got somewhat better, her neurological symptoms were still present.
Yeah, and the medications that I was put on would help in waves. At first, when I was put on medication after the initial almost shock to my system and the rejection and all the reactions I was having, I felt so much better. I was able to run outside, I was able to walk normally. Things were improving a lot, and then all of a sudden it would seem I would become more symptomatic, and that's kind of when we realized more was going on.
So the Lyme doctor referred us to a child neurologist closer to our home. She did a complete neurological workup and a psychoneurological test, and there were definitely deficits that were continuing to show. So she recommended that we see a Lyme doctor, a neurologist who specialized in Lyme, which we did, and he performed some tests, and Cathy was diagnosed with central nervous system Lyme. She was on ceftriaxone for 4 months, and she was also diagnosed with chronic inflammatory demyelinating neuropathy, autoimmune encephalitis, and posterior orthostatic tachycardia.
And when we saw this doctor, initially I felt so heard, I felt understood, and for the first time I was being treated as a whole person instead of as bits and pieces of symptoms.
So the treatment continued, and it's still somewhat ongoing. There are still some deficits, and we still have some autoimmune issues that we're dealing with, but overall there's been just more of a recovery than